Mirror of the idiot. How Kagame's leadership reflects his unconscious fears. Written by Gabriel Ndayishimiye. The greatest irony of leadership is often revealed in its contradictions, and Paul Kagame epitomizes this with surgical precision. Here is a man who castigates members of his own government as a spineless, denounces African leaders as idiots, and ridicules Western donors, the very lifeline of his governance, for their perceived interference. Yet the authoritarian strongman he projects masks a dependency so profound that every act of critique becomes a desperate disavowal of his own vulnerabilities. As he recently remarked during the diplomatic luncheon on January 16, 2025, "I know leaders when I see them. I also know idiots when I see them. You can imagine the combination of both of them. The disaster it is. If you are a leader and an idiot, it's a disaster. Absolute a disaster. It is even worse, even more dangerous, if the very people who hold the power in their hands decide that they will be manipulated and played around for some interest by idiots." These remarks, while bold and unapologetic, epitomize the contradictions in Kagame's governance. A leader dependent on external aid yet scorning his benefactors, portraying himself as a unifier while alienating peers, and decrying idiocy while nurturing an autocratic system that suppresses dissent. Below is a detailed critique of Kagame's leadership, framed around his own words. Kagame's harsh denunciation of idiot leaders reveals a classic case of projection, a psychological mechanism where one's own insecurities or flaws are externalized and attributed to others. This projection shapes his governance in critical ways, manifesting in policies that focus on suppressing dissent rather than addressing root causes of instability. In his dealings with international donors, Kagame's rhetoric of defiance belies a deeper dependency, creating a dynamic where he simultaneously resents and relies on their influence. Domestically, his projection targets critics and opposition figures, labeling them as threats to stability, which justifies authoritarian measures and stifles pluralistic discourse. This psychological defense mechanism ensures that Kagame's governance prioritizes control over adaptability, ultimately undermining its effectiveness and alienating those it seeks to manage or placate. By emphasizing the disaster of incompetent leadership, Kagame unconsciously distances himself from fears of his own shortcomings, using this rhetoric to craft an image of supreme competence and control. The very fixation on labeling others as idiots may suggest an internal struggle with perceived inadequacies or doubts about the sustainability of his authoritarian governance. Kagame's governance style reflects the super-ego in Freudian terms, an internalized moral authority that governs through discipline, suppression, and an obsessive need to assert order. Yet this superego is grotesquely inflated, a punitive force that polices not only the external world, but also Kagame's own psyche. His intolerance for dissent and rigid control over his administration are not signs of strength, but desperate attempts to annihilate the chaos he perceives lurking both within and outside his domain. This overcompensation, rooted in the fear of losing control, becomes a prison of his own making, a closed loop of discipline that punishes any deviation from the established order. The cost of this overactive superego is steep. It acts as a relentless censor, crushing not only dissent, but also the spontaneous forces of creativity, innovation, and the organic dynamism required for true leadership. For instance, Kagame's governance has systematically stifled independent media and civil society organizations, which are often key incubators for creative problem-solving and social innovation. Initiatives that could foster grassroots economic growth or technological innovation frequently encounter roadblocks in a system designed to centralize control rather than empower local agency. Furthermore, the climate of fear imposed by his administration discourages bold policy experimentation, leaving Rwanda reliant on rigid frameworks that fail to adapt to the complexities of a rapidly changing world. This suppression of creative potential not only stagnates progress, but also alienates the very minds capable of driving Rwanda forward, trapping the nation in a cycle of mediocrity enforced by the authoritarian grip of its leadership. In its zeal to maintain order, Kagame's governance reduces leadership to mechanical efficiency, stripping it of vitality and adaptability. This hypervigilant control paradoxically ensures its own vulnerability, as stagnation becomes an inevitable outcome of such an oppressive rigidity. Like a fortress built so secure that it traps its inhabitants, Kagame's governance model risks imploding under the weight of its own unyielding discipline. Kagame's governance thus becomes a sterile machine, efficient in appearance but brittle at its core, perpetually at risk of stagnation and implosion under the weight of its own oppressive rigidity. By silencing critique and alternative ideas, Kagame engages in repression, a key psychoanalytic concept where unwanted thoughts or impulses are pushed into the unconscious. This repression operates as a double-edged sword. It suppresses dissenting voices within the governance structure to preserve the illusion of unanimity, but it also creates a volatile undercurrent of resentment and resistance. Like repressed desires that inevitably resurface in destabilizing ways, this mechanism ensures that the marginalized perspectives Kagame seeks to bury will re-emerge, often explosively, through public discontent or upheaval. The repression he imposes becomes a latent ticking time bomb, a symptom of governance built on fear rather than genuine consensus. This ticking time bomb manifests in several tangible forms. Civil unrest looms as suppressed grievances and dissent bubble beneath the surface, creating the potential for explosive outbursts of discontent. Bureaucratic collapse becomes another inevitable consequence, as fear-driven governance fosters inefficiency, discourages initiative, and alienates capable leaders who might otherwise address systemic weaknesses. The longer this repressive system persists, the greater the risk that these underlying tensions will erupt in ways that destabilize the very foundation of Kagame's carefully constructed regime. Drawing on Lacan's mirror stage, Kagame's leadership can be interpreted as a perpetual struggle with misrecognition. A striking example of this can be seen in his handling of Rwanda's international reputation. While Kagame often projects an image of Rwanda as a beacon of stability and progress, this self-constructed facade frequently contrasts with reports from independent observers detailing repression of opposition voices and curtailment of freedoms. This divergence mirrors the misrecognition inherent in Kagame's leadership, an idealized self-image that fails to align with the fragmented, coercive reality of his governance. By dismissing dissent as mere idiocy, Kagame reinforces the illusion of control. Yet this very dismissal perpetuates a governance model deeply disconnected from the lived realities of its citizens and the evolving global critique. He projects an image of the ideal, infallible leader, but this self-image is fundamentally fragmented by the reality of his governance, a reality marked by coercion, dependency, and a brittle authoritarian structure. The act of branding dissenting ideas as threats or idiocy serves as a distorted mirror that flatters his self-perception, reinforcing the illusion of control and superiority. However, this construction is inherently fragile. Kagame's reliance on external validation, through metrics like economic growth and international praise, underscores his insecurity. Beneath the facade of certainty lies the constant threat of exposure, as the fragmented reality threatens to shatter the polished image he has so carefully curated. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow, the darker, unconscious aspects of the psyche, offers another lens. Kagame's obsession with idiots as a source of failure reveals a profound and troubling unconscious identification with this archetype. His fixation suggests not only a fear that the idiot resides within his shadow self, but also an ongoing internal struggle to suppress it. This projection manifests in his authoritarian measures to silence dissent and eradicate perceived incompetence. However, these actions are not merely political but deeply symbolic, a compulsive exorcism of the internal fear that his governance might itself be inadequate or vulnerable. The shadow, as Jung posits, grows darker and more powerful the more it is denied, and Kagame's relentless pursuit of control and perfection might be read as an unconscious acknowledgement of his own insecurities. Each act of suppression becomes an external reenactment of an internal battle, as Kagame wages war not only on his critics, but on the disowned aspects of his psyche. In trying to eradicate the shadow externally, Kagame risks embodying it entirely, transforming his governance into the very idiocy he so vehemently decries. This embodiment manifests in practical outcomes that underscore the psychological paradox of his leadership. Policies born from an obsessive need to suppress dissent often fail to address the underlying issues they target, creating bureaucratic inefficiencies and governance missteps. The erosion of public trust becomes inevitable as citizens recognize the gap between the facade of control and the fragmented reality beneath. Furthermore, Kagame's relentless drive to maintain order, an effort to exercise his shadow, fosters an environment of paranoia, where innovation and risk-taking are stifled. This rigidity not only alienates capable leaders within his administration, but also hampers Rwanda's long-term adaptability, turning the very mechanisms of his control into vulnerabilities that threaten the stability of his regime. Kagame's centralized authority evokes the image of a stern and overbearing father figure in a Freudian family dynamic, where the children, subordinates and citizens, are infantilized under the oppressive weight of paternal dominance. His disdain for dissent mirrors the punitive father's instinct to obliterate any challenge to his authority, driven less by a rational desire for order and more by an unconscious fear of his own inadequacy being exposed. In silencing rebellious offspring, critics and alternative voices, Kagame not only fosters alienation and resentment, but perpetuates a crippling dependency within the populace. This paternalistic model doesn't merely risk creating a lack of autonomy, it systematically ensures a population too subdued and conditioned to question authority, thereby undermining the very fabric of democratic and sustainable growth. The father's rigidity, an outward symbol of strength, masks a profound internal fragility, a terror of losing control that blinds Kagame to the long-term damage inflicted by his oppressive grip. This governance model, under the guise of protection, infantilizes an entire nation, breeding compliance at the cost of innovation, trust, and the essential dynamism that Rwanda desperately needs for its future. Kagame's critique of idiot leaders is a profound and unsettling confession of his own insecurities and defensive strategies, veiled under a rhetoric of strength. His governance style, marked by relentless projection, deep-seated repression, and the omnipresent weight of a punitive superego, exemplifies an authoritarian psyche caught in a vicious cycle of self-defeat. The rigidity of his rule emerges not from genuine confidence but from an unconscious acknowledgement of fragility, a desperate, almost compulsive attempt to suppress the chaos and vulnerability he perceives both within himself and his governance model. By externalizing these flaws onto donors, critics, and the specter of idiot leaders, Kagame constructs a fragile illusion of control. This relentless repression does not eliminate the perceived threats. Instead, it amplifies them, creating a brittle and volatile system, one that mirrors the very fragility Kagame seeks to suppress. Policies born of this mindset often become self-fulfilling prophecies of failure, as governance missteps, alienation of allies, and public distrust proliferate. Kagame's leadership, when seen as a mirror of the idiot, reflects his deepest unconscious fears, a terror that incompetence and chaos might already reside within the system he controls. His refusal to embrace pluralism is not a rational strategy, but an unconscious compulsion, rooted in the dread that openness would expose the contradictions underpinning his leadership and unravel the myth of his infallibility. This governance, then, is not simply a struggle against external dissent, but a desperate, almost theatrical attempt to obliterate the fragments of disorder he perceives in his own shadow. In this psychological war, Kagame's insecurities dictate national policy, turning his governance into a living projection of his internal turmoil. The repression he imposes externally only intensifies the chaos it seeks to contain, creating a volatile cycle where every act of control breeds further instability. His governance thus becomes a mirror, reflecting not the strength of a unified leader, but the fractured psyche of a man trapped within the contradictions of his own authoritarianism. This fractured psyche manifests in tangible ways: policies that prioritize absolute control over adaptability, bureaucratic bottlenecks that stymie progress, and a climate of paranoia that alienates allies and suppresses the very innovation needed for long-term sustainability. These contradictions are most evident in Kagame's obsessive centralization of power, which, while intended to project strength, reveals an underlying fear of disintegration. For instance, the suppression of dissenting voices, from political opponents to civil society activists, underscores a leadership model more invested in silencing perceived threats than in addressing systemic weaknesses. In the broader context, his governance reflects a psychological battle turned outward, with Rwanda becoming the stage for a leader's internal war with his own insecurities and fears of inadequacy. In this framework, Kagame is not merely waging war on dissenting voices, but on himself, with Rwanda forced to endure the catastrophic fallout of this deeply personal and unresolved conflict. This repression and projection create a brittle system that cannot sustain the weight of its own contradictions. Policies aimed at consolidating control often exacerbate the very dissent they seek to silence, fueling bureaucratic inefficiency and eroding public trust. Kagame's refusal to embrace pluralism is less a calculated decision than an unconscious compulsion, rooted in the fear that allowing diversity of thought would expose the cracks in his carefully curated facade of competence and order. This authoritarian model, rigid and unyielding, risks suffocating Rwanda's political and social development, leaving a nation trapped within the confines of its leaders' psychological defenses. By confronting these forces and embracing plurality, Kagame could achieve not just a more effective governance structure, but also liberation from the psychic prison his leadership has constructed.